Before we begin our story tonight, let us begin not with a sight, but with a scent, a memory. Think of a warm kitchen. Perhaps it's the kitchen of your childhood, bathed in the soft golden light of late afternoon. Think of the scent of cinnamon, warm, sweet, and woody, dusting a pastry or swirling in a hot drink. Think of the sharp, pungent aroma of black pepper, freshly ground, that makes you want to sneeze. The bright, festive perfume of cloves embedded in an orange. The exotic, earthy fragrance of nutmeg. These are the scents of comfort, of holidays, of home. They are so common in our modern world that we rarely give them a second thought. They sit patiently in small jars in our cupboards, their power dormant, waiting for a recipe to call them forth. We buy them for a few dollars at the local grocery store. But what if I told you that these humble, familiar dusts and seeds were once the engine of the world? What if I told you that for the sake of a handful of peppercorns, great ships were built to brave unknown oceans, that for the secret location of a single, clove-covered island, wars were fought and entire civilizations were brought to their knees? What if I told you that the very map of our world was drawn by men who were chasing a ghost on the tongue, a phantom of flavor, a scent on the wind? Tonight, we peel back the layers of the familiar. We journey back to a time when these kitchen comforts were more valuable than gold, more sought after than any jewel, a time when a pinch of dust could build an empire or burn it to the ground. This is the story of spices. To truly comprehend the seismic power that these small, dried things once held over the human imagination, we must first attempt to taste the world without them. Let us travel back to the dawn of civilization, to a European settlement in the Neolithic age. Imagine the daily meal. It is a meal born of necessity, of survival. A thick, porridge-like stew of boiled grains, barley, perhaps, or spelt, chunks of meat from a hunt, often tough and gamey, boiled or roasted over an open fire. Roots and tubers dug from the earth. The flavors are basic, earthy, monotonous. The primary method of food preservation is salting, if salt is available, or smoking. These methods add flavor, yes, but it is a harsh, overpowering flavor, a constant, single note of saltiness or smokiness that dominates every meal, day after day, season after season. Freshness is a fleeting luxury, enjoyed only in the brief warmth of summer. For most of the year, the diet consists of preserved, stored foods, and with storage comes the inevitable decay. Without refrigeration, food was in a constant battle against time, against the invisible forces of bacteria and rot. Meat that was not perfectly cured could develop off tastes. Grain stored in damp conditions could become musty. The palate of the ancient world was a landscape of blandness, punctuated by the sharp cliffs of salt and smoke, and haunted by the ever-present ghost of spoilage. There was no complexity, no surprise, no delightful, lingering warmth or exotic, transportive aroma. Food was fuel, plain and simple. Now, imagine into this monotonous world. A single peppercorn arrives. A merchant, traveling a long and perilous route, brings a small pouch of these tiny, black, wrinkled spheres. A single one is crushed and sprinkled into the communal stew. The effect is electric, a sudden, piercing heat that blossoms on the tongue, a pungent, woody aroma that cuts through the blandness like a bolt of lightning. It is a sensation unlike anything they have ever experienced. It is a spark of life in a gray world. It doesn't just change the taste of the food, it makes the person eating it feel more alive. This was the power of a spice. It was a culinary miracle, and humanity, once it had tasted this miracle, would develop an insatiable, world-altering craving for more. The first great civilization to harness the power of spices on a massive scale was not driven by a desire for flavor, but by a quest for immortality. Ancient Egypt. The Egyptian worldview was centered on the meticulous preservation of the body for its journey into the afterlife. The process of mummification was a sacred, scientific art form, and at its heart were spices. Let us enter the House of the Dead, a workshop where the embalmers perform their solemn duty. The air is thick with a strange, powerful cocktail of scents. After the internal organs are removed, the body cavity is rinsed and cleansed. Then it is packed with fragrant, powerful substances, not just salt, but bundles of myrrh and cassia and mounds of peppercorns and cumin. These were not chosen for their pleasant smell alone. The Egyptians, through centuries of observation, understood that these substances possessed powerful antibacterial and antifungal properties. The essential oils within them acted as potent preservatives, retarding the process of decay, keeping the flesh sanctified and intact for its journey to the next world. Frankincense and myrrh resins bled from trees in the distant, mysterious lands of southern Arabia and the Horn of Africa were particularly sacred. They were burned as incense in every temple, their fragrant smoke believed to be the very scent of the gods, a bridge between the earthly and the divine. To be embalmed with them was to be perfumed for an audience with Osiris himself. This spiritual necessity created the world's first great long-distance trade routes. The Egyptians did not know precisely where these magical substances came from. The lands of Punt and Sheba, as they knew them, were shrouded in myth and legend. So they built great ships to sail down the Red Sea. They organized vast camel caravans to traverse the deserts, led by Arab traders who fiercely guarded the secrets of their origins. These traders, to protect their monopoly and inflate their prices, spun fantastical tales. They told the Egyptians, and later the Greeks and Romans, that cinnamon grew in the nests of giant birds, perched on treacherous, unclimbable cliffs. To harvest it, one had to leave out large pieces of meat, which the birds would carry to their nests. The weight of the meat would cause the nests to fall, allowing the brave to collect the precious spice. They said that frankincense trees were guarded by winged serpents. These stories created an aura of immense danger, of mythical heroism around the spices. They were not mere commodities. They were treasures won from a world of monsters and magic. And this aura, this story, allowed the traders to charge truly astronomical prices. The pharaohs paid without question. For them, the price of a spice was the price of eternity itself. As the center of power shifted to Rome, the primary motivation for the spice trade evolved from the sacred to the profane, from the preservation of the dead to the pleasure of the living. Rome was the gilded, gluttonous, beating heart of the ancient world, and the Roman elite developed a passion for spices that bordered on obsession. Imagine a lavish banquet in the villa of a wealthy Roman senator. The air is heavy with the scent of burning incense, of perfumes, and, above all, of the food. The chef, likely a highly prized Greek slave, is a master of complex flavors. He does not use spices sparingly. He uses them with theatrical abandon. A roasted peacock is brought in, its feathers reattached, its beak gilded, but its flesh is stuffed with a mixture of dates, nuts, and a powerful blend of pepper, ginger, and cloves. Sauces are the soul of Roman cuisine, and these sauces are explosions of flavor. A common sauce, garum, a fermented fish sauce, is itself pungent, but to this, the chef adds honey for sweetness, vinegar for acidity, and a lavish amount of black pepper for heat. They used spices in everything, in their wine, which was often mulled with cinnamon and cloves, in their desserts, which were sweetened with honey and perfumed with nutmeg. This was not just about making food taste good. It was about displaying wealth and power in the most visceral way possible. To be able to afford and serve a dish that was laden with ingredients that had traveled thousands of miles, passing through the hands of countless merchants, each adding their own markup, was the ultimate status symbol. It was a way of saying, I am so wealthy that I can afford to eat the very essence of the exotic, the distant, and the impossibly expensive. The demand from Rome was so insatiable that it revolutionized the spice trade. The Romans, being pragmatic engineers and administrators, grew tired of the slow, expensive overland caravan routes controlled by the Arab traders and their fantastical stories. They discovered the secret of the monsoon winds. They learned that by sailing from Egyptian ports on the Red Sea, they could catch the seasonal winds that would blow their ships directly across the Indian Ocean to the spice ports of India's Malabar coast. And 6 months later, the winds would reverse, blowing them straight back. This discovery, the establishment of the maritime spice route, was a catastrophe for the overland Arab traders, but a boon for Rome. It cut out the middlemen. The volume of spices flowing into the empire increased 100-fold, and while prices dropped, they were still astronomically high for the common person. The Roman Empire became a giant engine, consuming the fragrant treasures of the East and paying for them with the gold and silver of the West. The historian Pliny the Elder complained bitterly that India was draining the empire of its wealth, 100 million sesterces a year, all for the fleeting pleasure of a sharp taste on the tongue. But his warnings were ignored. The craving was too deep, the habit too ingrained. The Omen world was addicted to spice. And so, in the ancient world, the foundations were laid. Spices were established in the human psyche not as mere flavorings, but as substances of immense power. They were the scent of the divine, the key to the afterlife. They were the ultimate symbol of wealth, the taste of earthly power. They were a medicine, believed to balance the body's humors and ward off disease. And they were a mystery. Their origins were veiled in secrecy, their journey fraught with a peril that only added to their allure. When the Roman Empire eventually crumbled, the direct sea lanes of trade fell into disuse. Europe entered a period of relative isolation, but the memory, the craving, did not die. It lingered. It lingered in the incense burned in the Christian churches, a direct continuation of Roman and Egyptian ritual. It lingered in the medicine cabinets of the monasteries, where ancient texts describing the healing properties of cloves and ginger were preserved. And it lingered in the halls of the new barbarian kings, who coveted the last remaining stores of pepper as a treasure worthy of royalty. The great Roman engine of consumption had stalled. The flow of spices into Europe slowed to a mere trickle. This scarcity would only make the craving more intense. And a new power, rising from the waters of a lagoon, would see this scarcity not as a problem, but as the greatest commercial opportunity the world had ever known. The stage was being set for a new gatekeeper and a new monopoly. And so, a new monopoly was waiting to be forged. Following the slow, inexorable collapse of the Western Roman Empire, Europe did not just fracture politically, it fractured sensorially. The intricate web of Roman trade, which had functioned like a great circulatory system, pumping the warm, fragrant blood of Eastern spices into the heart of Europe, had been severed. The world, for the average European, shrank. The horizons closed in. Life became intensely local. The food on your plate came from the field behind your village, the forest at the edge of your lord's domain, the river that flowed nearby. The great Roman roads, once bustling with merchants and legions, became dangerous. Overgrown paths haunted by bandits. The Mediterranean, once a unified Roman lake, became a treacherous sea, its shipping lanes preyed upon by pirates and rival fleets. The direct, predictable maritime route to the spices of India, powered by the monsoon winds, was forgotten in the West. That knowledge retreated, preserved only in the bustling port cities of the Byzantine and the newly ascendant Islamic worlds. For the common person in Frankish Gaul or Anglo-Saxon England, a peppercorn became a thing of pure legend, something their grandparents might have spoken of, a taste remembered only in the abstract. The European palate, which had been tantalized and educated by the complex flavors of the Roman banquet, was forced back into a state of medieval simplicity. Food was once again defined by salt, smoke, and the handful of pungent herbs that could be grown in a monastery garden: rosemary, thyme, sage. These were pleasant, but they lacked the fire, the exotic mystery, the sheer transformative power of the true spices from the East. Even for the kings and warlords who now ruled the fragmented lands, spices were a treasure of almost mythical rarity. They were not ingredients, they were diplomatic gifts. A small pouch of pepper could be used to seal a treaty. They were stored in royal treasuries alongside gold bullion and precious relics. They were counted out, peppercorn by peppercorn, a currency more stable and more coveted than most coins. This scarcity created a vacuum, a vast, Europe-wide hunger for a taste of a lost world. And into this vacuum, a single city, born of water and audacity, would sail. A city that would not discover the spices, but would master the one thing that had become even more valuable, the route to them. A city that would build its gilded empire on a bottleneck. Venice, the most serene republic, La Serenissima. As we have seen, this city was an anomaly. It had no fertile farmlands, no great mines, no vast forests. Its only resource was its location and the relentless, mercantile cunning of its people. While the rest of Europe turned inward, embroiled in feudal conflicts, Venice looked outward. It looked east. Its merchants understood a simple, profound truth. The old Roman world had fractured into two halves, a chaotic, impoverished, but spiritually unified Christian West, and a wealthy, sophisticated, and commercially vibrant Islamic and Byzantine East. Venice, positioned on the watery threshold between these two worlds, decided not to be a barrier, but to be the bridge, the only bridge, and on this bridge they would build a toll booth. The Venetians began by re-establishing the old trade links with Constantinople and the great port cities of the Levant, like Alexandria and Acre. They sailed their galleys, powered by both sail and oar, into harbors that were now the western termini of the great caravan routes. These were the funnels through which all the treasures of the East, the silk from China, the porcelain, the jewels, and most importantly, the spices from India and the distant spice islands, had to pass. Here, in these bustling cosmopolitan markets, the Venetian merchants would trade. They brought the raw materials of the West timber, iron, wool, and even enslaved people from the Slavic lands, and exchanged them for the finished luxuries of the East. But they were not just simple traders. They were master diplomats and strategists. They cultivated a special, often tense, but mutually beneficial relationship with the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, which controlled Alexandria. This was the single most important gateway for the spices that had traveled up the Red Sea from the Indian Ocean. While other Christian powers were engaged in the Crusades, often viewing the Islamic world as a monolithic enemy, the Venetians were pragmatic. They fought when they had to, but they preferred to deal. They negotiated exclusive contracts, paid the necessary tariffs and bribes, and secured for themselves a near-total monopoly on the European side of the spice trade. They became the sole purveyors, the exclusive distributors of the world's most sought-after commodity. Every other kingdom in Europe, from England to Portugal, if they wanted pepper, cloves, or nutmeg, they had to buy it from Venice. And Venice, understanding the raw, desperate power of this demand, could name its price. Let us follow the journey of a single clove to understand the genius and the rapacity of the Venetian system. Our clove begins its life on a tree, on a tiny volcanic island in the Moluccas, the Spice Islands of modern-day Indonesia, an island whose existence is not even a rumor in Europe. It is harvested by local islanders and sold to a Javanese or Malay trader. That trader sails it to the great port of Malacca, a bustling hub of Asian trade, and sells it to a Muslim merchant from India. The Indian merchant ships it across the Bay of Bengal to the Malabar coast. There, it is sold again to an Arab dhow captain. The dhow captain sails it across the Indian Ocean, up the Red Sea, to a port near the Nile. Here, it is unloaded, taxed by the local authorities, and loaded onto the back of a camel. The camel caravan carries it overland to the great city of Alexandria on the Mediterranean. At Alexandria, it is taxed again, heavily, by the Mamluk Sultan. It is then sold at a vastly inflated price to one person and one person only, a Venetian merchant. Up to this point, the clove has traveled thousands of miles, and its price has multiplied perhaps 100 times. But its journey is not over. The Venetian merchant loads it onto one of the Republic's great state-sponsored galleys. These were not small private ships. They were floating fortresses owned by the state and leased to the wealthiest merchant families, traveling in protected convoys called the Muda. The galley sails across the Mediterranean, back to the bustling port of Venice. Here, the clove is unloaded at the Rialto market. It is inspected, weighed, and taxed once again, this time by the Venetian Republic. It is then sold to a German or a Flemish merchant who has made the long, arduous journey over the Alps to Venice, because it is the only place in Europe he can acquire such a treasure. That German merchant then transports it by land and river back to the great market cities of Northern Europe, like Bruges or Antwerp. And there, finally, it might be sold to the chef of a duke or a king, who will use it to season a single, magnificent feast. The final price of that single clove in a London market could be as much as 1,000 times its original price on the island where it was grown. It was the most brilliant and the most predatory supply chain the world had ever seen. The Venetians were not just at the end of this chain. They had placed a lock on it, a Venetian lock, and they held the only key. The gold of Europe flowed in a torrent into the coffers of the Venetian Republic. This wealth funded their magnificent art, their breathtaking architecture, their powerful navy. The city of canals became a city built on pepper, a republic perfumed with the scent of cinnamon and cloves. To protect this golden goose, the Venetians, like the Arab traders before them, relied not just on naval power and exclusive contracts, but on the power of misinformation. They did everything they could to maintain the mystery of the spice's origins. They actively discouraged any other Europeans from attempting to trade directly with the Levant. They cultivated an aura of immense danger and complexity, suggesting that only they, with their unique and delicate relationship with the Saracens, could safely conduct this trade. When asked where the spices came from, they would shrug and offer vague, second-hand accounts, often repeating the old, fantastical stories of cinnamon birds and serpent-guarded trees. The less the rest of Europe knew, the better. The source of the spices was a geographical black hole in the European mind. They knew the spices arrived in Alexandria, but the world beyond that point was a place of myth and monsters, a place called India, or the Indies, a semi-mythical land of untold riches and wonders. This lack of knowledge, combined with the sheer, crushing cost of spices, created a deep and abiding resentment throughout the rest of Europe. Kings and queens in Lisbon, in Seville, in London, looked at their royal accounts and saw a crippling outflow of gold, all flowing to one arrogant, waterlogged city in the Adriatic. They saw Venice growing rich and powerful, funding its empire with a tax on every single European nobleman's dinner plate. The monopoly was economically strangling, but more than that, it was humiliating. A powerful sense of frustration began to build, a feeling that they were being held hostage. They did not just want cheaper spices. They wanted control. They wanted to bypass the Venetian Lock. They wanted to kick down the door and claim the treasure for themselves. And as the 15th century progressed, this frustration began to merge with a new spirit of inquiry, a new confidence that was sweeping across parts of Europe. The Renaissance. Maps were being redrawn. Ancient geographical texts, like those of Ptolemy, were being rediscovered and studied. Scholars began to question the old myths, and a new generation of sailors and shipbuilders, particularly on the Atlantic coast of the Iberian Peninsula, were developing new technologies and new ambitions. They looked at the vast, terrifying, and unknown expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, and they began to wonder, what if there was another way? What if they did not have to go through the Venetian bottleneck, through the Islamic world at all? What if a ship could sail south around the great, mysterious continent of Africa and arrive directly in the fabled Indies? Or, even more audaciously, what if, as some ancient texts suggested, the world was a sphere and one could reach the east by sailing west? These were radical, dangerous ideas, but they were ideas born of desperation and desire. The Venetian Lock was so strong, so absolute, that it was forcing the rest of the world to dream of a new key. A key made not of diplomacy and gold, but of courage, of innovation, and of the open sea. The key to unlocking the Venetian monopoly would not be forged in the crowded markets of the Mediterranean, but on the windswept western edge of Europe, a nation with its back to the old world and its face to the vast, intimidating emptiness of the Atlantic Ocean. Portugal. For centuries, Portugal had been a peripheral player, a small, rugged kingdom clinging to the edge of the Iberian Peninsula, defined by its long and arduous struggle to drive the Moors out of its territory, the Reconquista. Unlike the wealthy Italian city-states, Portugal had no established trade routes to the east. It was at the very end of the Venetian supply chain, forced to pay the highest prices for the merest trickle of spice that reached its shores. To the great powers of Europe, it was something of a backwater. But this geographical isolation, this seeming disadvantage, would become its greatest strength. The Portuguese were not Mediterranean sailors, they were Atlantic sailors. Their entire national character was shaped by a different kind of sea. Not the relatively calm, enclosed waters of the Mare Nostrum, but the wild, unpredictable, and immensely powerful Atlantic, with its colossal waves, its mysterious currents, and its terrifying, horizonless expanse. Their fishermen ventured far from shore in small boats, chasing cod into the treacherous North Atlantic. Their sailors knew the violence of ocean storms and the profound, humbling loneliness of being a tiny speck of wood in a world of water. This constant struggle with the ocean bred a unique kind of mariner, tough, pragmatic, and possessed of a quiet, stubborn courage, and it drove them to build a unique kind of ship. The traditional vessel of the Mediterranean was the galley, a long, slender ship powered primarily by banks of oarsmen, perfect for the calm seas and coastal raiding of that sea. But a galley was utterly useless in the great swells of the Atlantic. The Portuguese, borrowing and refining designs from both Northern Europe and the Arab world, developed a new kind of vessel, the caravel. It was a masterpiece of naval engineering. Imagine it, a ship that was relatively small but deep and wide, able to withstand the punishment of oceanic waves. It featured a high, defensible stern castle and forecastle. But its true genius lay in its sails. It combined the traditional square sails of Northern Europe, which were excellent for running with the wind behind you, with the triangular lateen sails of the Arab dhows. These lateen sails allowed a ship to do something almost magical, to sail against the wind, tacking back and forth in a zigzag pattern. For the first time, a ship was not a passive victim of the wind's direction. It could be an active participant, a master of its own course. The caravel was the key. It was the tool that could unlock the ocean. A tool, however, is useless without a vision, and the vision for Portugal's destiny would be provided by one of the most enigmatic and influential figures of the age, Prince Henry, known to history as Henry the Navigator. Henry was a fascinating paradox. He was a deeply pious man, a Grand Master of the Military Order of Christ, driven by a crusading zeal to continue the fight against the Islamic powers. Yet, he was also a pragmatic, almost scientific, modern thinker, obsessed with geography, cartography, and the potential for new trade routes. He was not, in fact, a navigator himself. It is believed he only ever made a few short sea voyages. His genius was not on the deck of a ship, but as a grand strategist, a patron, a central node of knowledge. At his court, on the windswept promontory of Sagres, the southwesternmost point of Europe, Henry established what was essentially the world's first state-sponsored institute for advanced oceanic research. He gathered around him the finest minds he could find, experienced sea captains who had braved the African coast, Jewish and Arab cartographers who possessed geographical knowledge unknown to most of Christian Europe, Italian shipwrights who knew the latest in vessel design, astronomers who could improve the art of celestial navigation, using tools like the quadrant and the astrolabe to determine a ship's latitude from the stars. Sagres became a laboratory for exploration. Information from every voyage was brought back, recorded, and compiled. Maps were constantly updated. The treacherous currents, the prevailing winds, the safe harbors along the African coast, all were painstakingly documented. Each journey built upon the knowledge of the last. It was a slow, systematic, and incredibly expensive process of chipping away at the edge of the unknown. Henry's initial motivation was a mixture of goals. He sought the legendary Christian kingdom of Prester John, believed to exist somewhere in Africa or Asia, hoping to forge a grand alliance against Islam. He sought to tap into the lucrative West African trade in gold and slaves. But overshadowing all of this was the ultimate prize, the ghost on the tongue, the spices of the Indies. He and his circle of advisors knew that the Venetian monopoly was the source of the Mamluk Sultanate's wealth in Egypt, the very same power that stood as a great barrier to Christian ambitions in the Holy Land. To find a direct sea route to the spices would not just be an act of commercial genius, it would be an act of geopolitical warfare. It would cut the economic legs out from under their rivals. It would redirect the entire flow of global wealth from the canals of Venice to the harbor of Lisbon. It was a dream of breathtaking audacity, and Prince Henry, with his immense wealth and royal authority, dedicated his entire life and the resources of his kingdom to turning that dream into a reality, one perilous voyage at a time. The task facing Henry's captains was monumental. To the European mind of the 15th century, the Atlantic coast of Africa was a place of profound terror. Their maps of the region were largely blank, filled not with geographical features, but with warnings and monsters. Here be dragons. There was a very real psychological barrier at a place called Cape Bojador. It was a point on the coast of the Western Sahara, known for its violent currents and treacherous fogs. For centuries, European sailors had believed it was the edge of the navigable world. They believed that beyond this point, the sea literally boiled. They believed that the sun was so hot it would turn a white man's skin black. They believed in sea monsters that could swallow a ship whole. This was the Cape of Fear. It took 15 separate expeditions, sent out by Prince Henry over a period of 12 years, before one of his captains, Gil Inez, finally summoned the courage to do what no one had done before. In 1434, he sailed his caravel far out into the open Atlantic, away from the treacherous coastal currents, and looped back around, successfully passing the dreaded Cape. He found no boiling seas, no monsters. He found only more ocean and more coast. This single act, though geographically minor, was a psychological breakthrough of immense importance. the wall of fear had been breached. And so began the slow, painstaking, generation-long crawl down the coast of Africa. Each voyage pushed a little further. They reached the mouth of the Senegal River. Encountering the vibrant cultures of West Africa, they established trading posts, exchanging European goods for gold, ivory, and tragically, the beginnings of the transatlantic slave trade. They crossed the equator, a terrifying prospect for sailors who relied on the North Star for navigation. They had to learn a whole new sky, new constellations. Prince Henry died in 1460, long before his ultimate dream was realized. But the momentum he had created was now unstoppable. It had become a national obsession. The Portuguese crown, now under King John II, continued the quest with renewed vigor. The information compiled at Sagres provided the foundation for ever more ambitious voyages. The ultimate geographical question remained: was Africa a continent that stretched all the way to a frozen southern pole? Or did it have an end? Was there a southern tip around which a ship could pass into the Indian Ocean? The ancient texts were contradictory. The maps were blank. The only way to know was to go. In 1487, King John commissioned a veteran captain named Bartholomew Dias to lead a new expedition with a single, clear objective: find the southern end of the continent, whatever the cost. Dias set sail with 2 caravels and a supply ship. He followed the now familiar coast down past the Congo River, past the Namibian desert. Then, south of the Tropic of Capricorn, he was hit by a ferocious storm. For 13 days, his small ships were at the mercy of the elements. The wind and waves drove them relentlessly south, far out of sight of land, into the cold, gray, unknown waters of the South Atlantic. The men were terrified. They believed they had been blown off the edge of the world. When the storm finally abated, Dias, a navigator of exceptional skill, turned his ships east, expecting to find the coastline again. He sailed for several days. Nothing. Only empty ocean. A terrifying thought must have entered his mind. Had they already passed the southern tip without realizing it? Making a bold decision, he turned his ships north, and after a few days, on February 3rd, 1488, a lookout shouted from the crow's nest, "Land!" But it was a different kind of land. The coast they saw was not running north to south, as it had for thousands of miles. It was running east. Dias and his crew had done it. They had rounded the southern tip of Africa. They had, without knowing it, entered the Indian Ocean. He wanted to continue on, to push for India itself, but his crew, exhausted, terrified, and on the verge of mutiny, refused. Their food was running low. Their ships were battered. They had been at sea for months. They forced him to turn back. On the return journey, they finally saw the great cape that had been hidden from them by the storm. Dias, in memory of the terrible ordeal they had endured, named it the Cape of Storms, Cabo das Tormentas. When he returned to Lisbon and reported his findings to King John II, the king listened intently. He understood the monumental significance of Dias's discovery. This was not a Cape of Storms. This was the gateway they had been seeking for nearly a century. The king, with a flair for branding and a vision of the future, renamed it. He called it the Cape of Good Hope, Cabo da Boa Esperança, because it was not an end, but a beginning. It was a promise, the promise of a direct route to the spices, the promise of an empire built on the sea. The Venetian lock was beginning to rust. The key was almost in their grasp. The promise of the Cape of Good Hope hung in the air of Lisbon, a tantalizing scent of imminent triumph. The Portuguese had found the gateway. All that remained was to undertake the final, perilous voyage through it. But while Portugal was meticulously planning its next move, a new, audacious idea was captivating the court of its great Iberian rival, Spain. This idea was championed by a tenacious and somewhat eccentric Genoese mariner named Christopher Columbus. Columbus had spent years studying the same ancient maps and texts as the Portuguese, but he had come to a different and far more radical conclusion. He had become utterly convinced by the theories that the world was a sphere and, crucially, a much smaller sphere than most scholars believed. He argued that the fastest way to the riches of the East was not to endure the long, agonizing journey around Africa, but to sail directly west. He believed that the fabled lands of Cipango, Japan, and Cathay, China, lay just a few weeks' sail across the Atlantic. He first presented his plan to the King of Portugal, the very power most invested in the African route. They listened, their expert navigators consulted, and they dismissed him. Their calculations, which were far more accurate, showed that the ocean was vastly larger than Columbus imagined. They politely showed him the door. Undeterred, Columbus took his Enterprise of the Indies to the Spanish court of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. For years, they too kept him waiting, preoccupied with the final stages of their own Reconquista, the expulsion of the last Moorish kingdom from Granada. But in 1492, with Granada finally conquered, Isabella, perhaps driven by a desire to compete with Portugal's imminent success, perhaps by a flicker of genuine faith in Columbus's vision, agreed to fund his desperate gamble. In August of that same year, with 3 small caravels, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Niña Columbus, sailed out of the port of Palos and into the sunset. He was not just sailing a ship, he was sailing a theory. His journey was a masterpiece of navigation and of man management. After a month at sea with no sign of land, his crew grew restless, terrified they had sailed into a void from which they could never return. Columbus calmed their fears, doctored the ship's logs to make the distance traveled seem shorter, and pushed onward, his faith in his own calculations unshakable. On the 12th of October 1492, a lookout on the Pinta sighted land. Columbus had found it, or so he thought. He was convinced he had landed on an island in the East Indies, near the coast of Asia. He called the gentle Taino people he encountered Indians. He searched in vain for the grand cities of the Great Khan and the fabled gold-roofed temples of Cipango. He did not find them. He found a world that was entirely new, a world whose existence no European had ever suspected. He had, of course, not reached Asia. He had stumbled upon the Americas. In his quest for the scent of the old world's spices, he had inadvertently discovered a new world. His voyage, a glorious failure in its stated objective, would ultimately redraw the map of the planet and initiate an era of conquest and exchange that would change the course of human history. He never found the peppercorns he sought, but he brought back other New World spices, chili peppers, and allspice that would soon find their own place in the global palate. The Spanish gamble, born from a geographical miscalculation, had yielded a prize of unimaginable proportions, but the original prize, the direct route to the true Indies, was still there for the taking. Back in Lisbon, the news of Columbus's voyage was met with a mixture of skepticism and alarm. The Portuguese did not believe he had reached Asia, but they knew the Spanish were now a serious rival in the race for oceanic empire. The pressure was on. The time for cautious, incremental steps was over. It was time for the final, definitive push. The man chosen by the new king, Manuel I, to lead this epic voyage was not a gentle scholar or a dreamy theorist. He was Vasco da Gama. Da Gama was a man of the New Age. He was a nobleman, a skilled navigator, and a soldier. He was described as tough, proud, fiercely determined, and, when necessary, utterly ruthless. He was not an explorer in the romantic sense. He was the commander of a strategic military and commercial mission. He was not being sent to discover. He was being sent to open a trade route by any means necessary. His fleet, which set sail from the mouth of the Tagus River in July of 1497, was small, but purpose-built for the monumental task ahead. It consisted of 4 vessels. 2 were heavy, custom-built carracks, the São Gabriel and the São Rafael. They were larger and sturdier than caravels, designed to carry more cargo and withstand the immense journey. They were floating fortresses, bristling with cannons. There was also a smaller, nimbler caravel, the Barrio, for scouting, and a large store ship to carry supplies. The crew of around 170 men were the best Portugal had to offer. Experienced pilots who had sailed with Dias, gunners, carpenters, and soldiers. But da Gama also brought linguists who could speak Arabic, and even a few degradados convicts who could be used for the most dangerous first contact missions ashore. Every detail was planned. They carried maps and navigational charts compiled from decades of Portuguese exploration. They carried goods for trade wool, ironware, and beads, though, as they would soon find, these were pitifully inadequate for the sophisticated markets of the East. And they carried the full authority of their king, embodied in stone pillars called padrões, which they were to erect on newly discovered lands to claim them for Portugal. Da Gama's first brilliant decision was navigational. Instead of hugging the African coast as all his predecessors had done, he used his knowledge of the Atlantic winds to make a great, sweeping arc out into the open ocean. The Volta du Marche, he sailed southwest almost to the coast of Brazil before catching the prevailing westerlies that would shoot his fleet directly towards the Cape of Good Hope. It was an enormous gamble. For 93 days, they saw no land. It was the longest voyage out of sight of land in European history up to that point, but it worked. It was a faster, more efficient route, and it demonstrated a new, confident mastery of oceanic navigation. After rounding the Cape of Good Hope, Da Gama's fleet entered a new world, the Indian Ocean. This was not an empty ocean. For centuries, it had been a vibrant, bustling, and almost exclusively Muslim maritime world. A network of trade connected the Swahili city-states of East Africa, the ports of Arabia and Persia, and the great spice markets of India. It was a world of the lateen-sailed dhow, of sophisticated merchants, and of ancient, established protocols. Into this world, Da Gama's battered, barnacle-encrusted ships arrived like an alien intrusion. His first encounters on the coast of East Africa, in places like Mozambique and Mombasa, were fraught with suspicion and hostility. The local Muslim sultans and merchants saw these strange, pale-skinned Christians not as simple traders, but as intruders, pirates, and a direct threat to their established networks. Da Gama's aggressive, often violent responses to this hostility set a grim precedent for what was to come. He was a crusader as much as a trader. But further up the coast, in the friendlier port of Malindi, his luck changed. He found a local pilot who knew the secrets of the monsoon winds, a man who, legend has it, was the great Arab navigator Ahmad ibn Majid. With this expert guide, Da Gama's fleet left the coast of Africa and struck out east, across the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean. The monsoon winds filled their square sails. After a swift 23-day crossing, on the 20th of May 1498, a lookout sighted the high green hills of the Western Ghats. They had arrived, Calicut, on the Malabar coast of India, the heart of the global pepper trade. The moment of first contact was a cocktail of triumph and cultural misunderstanding. Da Gama and his men, believing the Hindus they encountered to be some long-lost sect of Christians, even prayed in one of their temples. When Da Gama was finally granted an audience with the Zamarin, the Hindu ruler of Calicut, the meeting was a near disaster. The Zamarin, accustomed to receiving lavish gifts of gold and silver from Arab merchants, was utterly unimpressed by the paltry trade goods the Portuguese had brought: striped cloth, strings of coral beads, and wash basins. The local Arab merchants, who instantly recognized the existential threat the Portuguese represented, did everything in their power to sabotage the negotiations. Despite the tension, the hostility, and the diplomatic blunders, Da Gama succeeded in his primary mission. He was able to trade, albeit with great difficulty, and load his ships with a precious cargo of pepper, cinnamon, ginger, and cloves. He had the proof, he had the prize. After a tense 3 months, he set sail for home, leaving behind a wake of suspicion and animosity that would soon erupt into open warfare. The journey home was an unmitigated horror. Da Gama had left India at the wrong time of year, sailing against the monsoon winds. The crossing of the Indian Ocean, which had taken 23 days on the way out, now took a grueling 132 days. The fresh food and water ran out, and then the most dreaded of all maritime diseases struck: scurvy. Men who had survived storms and battles were now brought down by a simple lack of vitamin C. Their gums swelled and turned black, their teeth fell out, old wounds reopened, their bodies were racked with excruciating pain. They grew too weak to even work the sails. They died, one by one, their bodies unceremoniously dropped into the vast, indifferent ocean. By the time the fleet finally reached Malindi in Africa, more than half the crew had perished. The São Rafael was in such bad condition, with not enough men left to sail it, that Da Gama ordered it to be burned. The rest of the journey was a long, painful limp home. Finally, in the summer of 1499, almost 2 years after they had departed, the first of the surviving ships, the Berrio, limped into the mouth of the Tagus River, followed weeks later by Da Gama on the flagship São Gabriel. Of the 4 ships and 170 men that had set out, only 2 ships and 55 men returned. It was a catastrophic loss of life. But in the holds of those 2 battered ships was a cargo of spices. When that cargo was sold on the European market, the profits were staggering. It is estimated that the voyage yielded a return of over 3,000% on the original investment. Vasco da Gama was hailed as a hero. He had succeeded where generations had failed. He had not just found a new trade route, he had found the future of his nation. The Venetian Lock was not just rusted, it had been shattered. The world's economic center of gravity began a seismic shift, away from the enclosed Mediterranean and towards the open Atlantic. The news sent shock waves through the great merchant houses of Venice and the Mamluk Sultanate in Cairo. They knew instantly that their world was over. The Portuguese now held the key, and they would use it not to build a bridge of peaceful trade, but to forge an empire of cannon and gunpowder in an ocean that would soon run red with the blood of what would become the Spice Wars. The return of Vasco da Gama's battered ships was not the end of a story, but the firing of a starting pistol. A race had begun, but the Portuguese were determined that it would be a race with only one winner. They understood, with a cold, brutal clarity, that they could not compete with the established Muslim and Hindu merchants of the Indian Ocean on purely commercial terms. Their trade goods were inferior. Their knowledge of the local markets was non-existent. Their numbers were few. So they chose to compete with the one overwhelming advantage they possessed, the terrifying, destructive power of their naval cannons. The Portuguese who returned to the Indian Ocean in the years immediately following da Gama's voyage were not merchants seeking to join a marketplace. They were crusaders and conquerors seeking to seize it. Their strategy, known as the Estado da India, was the brainchild of the brilliant and utterly ruthless Viceroy Afonso de Albuquerque. The plan was to establish a series of heavily fortified naval bases at key strategic choke points, creating a maritime empire that could control, tax, and dominate all trade in the region. They did not need to conquer vast territories of land. They only needed to control the sea lanes. The caravel and the carrack were transformed from vessels of discovery into platforms of naval warfare. Their bronze cannons could outrange and outgun any ship in the Indian Ocean. They could reduce a coastal city's fortifications to rubble from a safe distance. Portugal brought a new, terrifying form of violence to a world that, while not always peaceful, was accustomed to a different set of rules. The events that followed were a litany of brutality. In 1502, on his second voyage, Vasco da Gama, seeking to intimidate the ruler of Calicut, intercepted a pilgrim ship, the Miri, returning from Mecca. The ship was filled with hundreds of men, women, and children. After looting the ship, da Gama ordered it to be set ablaze, refusing to allow any of the passengers to escape. He and his men watched for hours as the ship burned and sank, listening to the screams of those trapped inside. It was an act of calculated, genocidal terror, designed to send a single, unmistakable message across the ocean: submit or be annihilated. Albuquerque captured the key port of Goa on the coast of India, making it his heavily fortified capital. He seized Malacca, the great trading hub in Southeast Asia, giving Portugal control of the gateway to the Spice Islands themselves. He blockaded the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, attempting to strangle the old Venetian Mamluk trade route at its source. They implemented a system called the cartaz. Any local ship wishing to trade in the Indian Ocean had to purchase a license, a cartaz, from the Portuguese. If a ship was found without one, its cargo would be confiscated, its crew executed, and its vessel sunk. It was a protection racket on an oceanic scale. The Portuguese had become the new gatekeepers, but they were gatekeepers who ruled not through commerce, but through fear and gunpowder. For nearly a century, the Portuguese monopoly held. They grew fantastically wealthy. The port of Lisbon replaced Venice as the spice capital of Europe. But their empire was brittle. It was vast, overstretched, and administered by a small nation with a limited population. It was an empire built on violence, and it bred resentment everywhere it went. And in the cold, Protestant north of Europe, a new kind of rival was emerging. A rival that would fight the Portuguese not with the zeal of a crusader, but with the cold, calculating efficiency of a modern corporation: the Dutch. The Netherlands, at the end of the 16th century, was a nation forged in rebellion. After a long and bloody war of independence against their Spanish masters, who now also ruled Portugal, the Dutch Republic emerged as a new, dynamic force in Europe. They were pragmatic, fiercely capitalistic, and the undisputed masters of shipbuilding and maritime trade. Initially, they were content to act as the distributors of Portuguese spices throughout northern Europe from the great port of Antwerp and later Amsterdam. But when Spain closed the port of Lisbon to Dutch ships, it was an act of economic warfare that forced the Dutch hand. If they could no longer buy the spices, they would have to do what the Portuguese had done a century before: sail to the source and take them. The Dutch approach was fundamentally different from the Portuguese. Their expeditions were not funded by the crown, but by private investors, merchants, bankers, and ordinary citizens who pooled their resources in hopes of immense profits. After a series of successful but chaotic and competitive early voyages, the Dutch government took a revolutionary step. In 1602, they consolidated all of these competing companies into a single, colossal entity, the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, the VOC, the Dutch East India Company. The VOC was a new kind of beast in the world. It was not just a trading company. It was a proto-state, a multinational corporation with governmental powers. The Dutch government granted the VOC a 21-year monopoly on all Dutch trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. It was given the power to build forts, to raise its own armies and navies, to negotiate treaties, to wage war, and even to colonize territories. It was, arguably, the most powerful corporation in human history. Its sole, legally mandated objective was not glory, not faith, but profit for its shareholders, and it would pursue this objective with a ruthlessness that would make even the Portuguese seem humane. The arrival of the VOC's heavily armed fleets in the East Indies marked the beginning of the true spice wars. This was not a conflict between nations in the traditional sense. It was a war of corporate takeover. The VOC systematically and brutally dismantled the Portuguese maritime empire. Their ships were newer, faster, and better armed. Their organization was more efficient. They blockaded Goa. They captured Malacca in 1641, seizing the strategic strait. They drove the Portuguese out of Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, the source of the finest cinnamon. One by one, the Portuguese forts fell. The VOC did not just want to join the spice trade, they wanted to own it, from the tree to the final sale in Amsterdam. And that meant achieving a total ironclad monopoly on the most valuable spices of all, cloves, and especially nutmeg. These spices grew only in one tiny, isolated place on Earth, the Moluccas, the legendary spice islands in modern-day Indonesia. Cloves grew on a handful of small islands. Nutmeg and its lacy red covering, mace, grew only on the even tinier cluster of the Banda Islands. The VOC's strategy was chillingly simple. They would conquer these islands, and then, to ensure their monopoly, they would eradicate the spice trees from every other island, concentrating the entire world's supply in a few, easily guarded locations. This policy brought them into direct conflict with the people who had lived on these islands for centuries, the Bandanese. The Bandanese had a long tradition of free trade, dealing with Javanese, Chinese, and Arab merchants. They had no desire to sell their precious nutmeg exclusively to the Dutch at a fixed, low price. They resisted. What followed was an act of corporate-sponsored genocide. In 1621, the new Governor-General of the VOC, the cold and methodical Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, arrived at the Banda Islands with a fleet of warships and an army of mercenaries. His orders were to break the Bandanese resistance once and for all. Over the course of a few months, his forces systematically slaughtered or enslaved almost the entire population of the islands. Of an original population of around 15,000, it is estimated that fewer than 1,000 survived. The villages were burned, the local leaders were publicly executed. The now empty islands were then repopulated with Dutch planters, or perkeneers, and a workforce of slaves brought from other parts of Asia. The entire island chain was transformed into a giant, militarized nutmeg plantation, owned and operated for the exclusive profit of the VOC's shareholders in Amsterdam. This was the dark heart of the spice trade. A paradise island, depopulated and enslaved, for the sake of a fragrant nut that would be used to flavor cakes and preserve meats in the kitchens of Europe. The VOC's only serious European rival in this period was another, similar entity, the English East India Company, chartered by Queen Elizabeth I in 1600. The EIC was initially a much smaller and less powerful organization than its Dutch counterpart. The English, too, sought a piece of the lucrative spice trade. Their early attempts to establish a foothold in the Spice Islands led to one of the most infamous incidents of the era. On the small island of Ambon, the Dutch and English had a shared trading post. Tensions were high. In 1623, the Dutch governor, convinced that the English were plotting a takeover, arrested the chief English agent, Gabriel Towerson, and his men. After brutal torture, the English merchants confessed to a conspiracy. 10 of them, along with 10 Japanese mercenaries, were publicly beheaded. The Amboina Massacre, as it became known in England, caused a wave of outrage. It effectively drove the English out of the Spice Islands for good. Forced out of the most profitable trade, the EIC turned its attention elsewhere, to a place the Dutch considered a backwater, India. There, the English began a slow, patient process of establishing trading posts, or factories, in places like Surat, Madras, and Calcutta. They focused on other goods, Indian textiles, indigo dye, and, of course, pepper. It was a strategic retreat that would, in the long run, prove to be a stroke of genius. While the Dutch VOC bled its resources maintaining its brutal, but ultimately fragile, spice monopoly on a few small islands, the English EIC was slowly, almost imperceptibly, laying the foundations for a vast territorial empire on the Indian subcontinent. The Spice Wars had forced a diversion that would lead to the British Raj, the jewel in the crown of a future empire that would dwarf all others, The quest for a fragrant seed had led, circuitously, to the conquest of a subcontinent. But for a time, in the mid-17th century, the VOC stood supreme. It had achieved what no nation or empire had ever achieved before: a near-perfect global monopoly on the world's most valuable commodities. In Amsterdam, the prices for nutmeg and cloves skyrocketed to absurd levels. To keep prices high, the company would publicly burn massive warehouses full of excess spices, the fragrant smoke hanging over the city like a perverse incense of pure profit. The Dutch Golden Age, the age of Rembrandt, Vermeer, and Spinoza, was a civilization financed by this brutal, efficient, and fantastically profitable enterprise. The scent of empire was the scent of nutmeg, and for those who knew its origins, it was also the scent of blood. But like all monopolies built on violence and secrecy, it was destined to be broken. A new kind of hero was needed, not a warrior or a king, but a botanist and a thief. A monopoly built on blood and fire cannot last forever. The Dutch VOC had created a fortress around the Spice Islands, a fortress guarded by warships, cannons, and a policy of terror. They believed their control over cloves and nutmeg was absolute. But they had overlooked one fundamental truth of nature: life wants to spread. And they had underestimated the obsessive determination of a single, remarkable Frenchman named Pierre Poivre. Poivre was not a soldier or a merchant in the traditional sense. He was a botanist, a naturalist, an adventurer, and a colonial administrator. His name, amusingly, translates to Peter Pepper. It was as if he was destined for this life. As a young man, he had traveled extensively in the East, and he had witnessed firsthand the brutal efficiency of the Dutch monopoly and the staggering profits it generated. He saw the poverty and oppression it caused in the regions under its control. To Poivre, this was not just an economic injustice, it was an affront to nature. He became convinced that these precious spice trees, which the Dutch treated as their exclusive property, were a gift of providence to all mankind. He developed a singular, life-consuming obsession to break the Dutch monopoly, not with cannons, but with botany. He would steal the mother plants, the living seedlings of clove and nutmeg, and transplant them to French-controlled territories. It was an act of botanical piracy, an incredibly dangerous and audacious heist. The Dutch guarded their spice islands with paranoid vigilance. Any unauthorized foreign ship approaching the islands would be fired upon. They had a policy of coating all nutmegs destined for export with lime, which killed the seed's viability, preventing it from being germinated. To succeed, Poivre needed not just the dried spice, but the living, fertile seeds, or, even better, the delicate, living seedlings. For years, Poivre organized a series of clandestine expeditions. He used his position as an administrator on the French-controlled islands of Mauritius and Réunion in the Indian Ocean as his base of operations. He sent out small, fast ships, captained by men he trusted, with orders to covertly approach the less guarded islands in the Moluccas under the cover of darkness. They were to bribe, cajole, or trade with any locals who were willing to defy the Dutch. His first few attempts ended in failure. Seeds were acquired, but they were the wrong species, or they died during the long, arduous sea journey back. The Dutch were always watching. The risks were immense. But Poivre was relentless. He was a man driven by a scientific and patriotic fervor. He believed that the future of France's colonial prosperity depended on the success of his mission. The breakthrough came in the early 1770 seconds. Imagine the scene. A small, nondescript French ship, the Étoile du Matin, anchored in a hidden cove on a remote island near the Moluccas. The captain, under Poivre's orders, has made contact with a local ruler who resents the Dutch yoke. In the dead of night, a secret transaction takes place. In exchange for muskets, textiles, and silver, the islanders bring forth the prize, not just sacks of dried spices, but carefully wrapped parcels containing living things. There are hundreds of young nutmeg plants, their roots packed in earth, and, even more precious, several dozen clove seedlings, the most delicate and difficult to transport of all. This was the jackpot, the living, breathing heart of the Dutch monopoly. The journey back to Mauritius was a race against time and nature. The precious seedlings were treated like royalty. They were kept on the quarterdeck, protected from the harsh salt spray, shaded from the direct sunday. They were watered daily with the ship's precious supply of fresh water. The ship's botanist would have tended to them with the care of a physician, watching for any sign of wilt or disease. The ship had to avoid Dutch patrols, navigating through treacherous, uncharted waters. Every sail on the horizon was a potential threat. When the Étoile du Matin finally arrived in Port Louis, Mauritius, Poivre must have felt a sense of triumph that few people in history have ever known. He had done it. He had breached the fortress. He personally oversaw the planting of these botanical refugees in his magnificent new botanical garden at Pamplemousses. This was not just a garden. It was an acclimatization center, a laboratory where he and his team would learn to cultivate these delicate plants in a new home, thousands of miles from their native soil. The first successful flowering of a clove tree and the fruiting of a nutmeg tree on French soil were events of national importance. The seeds and seedlings from this mother garden were then distributed to other French colonies, Réunion, the Seychelles, and even as far as French Guiana in South America. The monopoly was broken. The genie was out of the bottle. The clove and the nutmeg, once prisoners of a tiny archipelago, were now citizens of the world. Poivre's success was the beginning of the end. The Dutch VOC, already overstretched and corrupt, began a slow decline. The final nail in the coffin of the spice monopoly was the rise of the British Empire. During the Napoleonic Wars, when the Netherlands was occupied by France, the British seized the Dutch colonies in the east, including the Spice Islands themselves. The British East India Company, unlike the Dutch, had a different philosophy. Their primary interest was not in maintaining an artificially high price for a few rare commodities, but in encouraging mass production and mass consumption. They took the spice plants that the French had already spread, and they spread them even further. They established vast clove plantations in places like Zanzibar, off the coast of Africa, which soon became the world's largest producer. They planted nutmeg in their Caribbean colonies like Grenada, which became known as the Isle of Spice. The result of this global proliferation was predictable. Supply exploded. What was once the rarest of treasures, grown only on a handful of tiny islands, was now a global agricultural commodity. And as supply went up, prices plummeted. The process was gradual, but over the course of the 19th century, spices began a slow, steady march from the king's banquet table to the common person's kitchen cupboard. A substance that had once been used to pay a soldier's salary could now be purchased by that soldier's wife for a few pennies at the local market. Cinnamon, which had once required a fantastical story about giant birds to justify its price, was now a common flavoring for a child's breakfast. Pepper, which had once been counted out by the single corn, was now a standard fixture on every dining table, sitting unassumingly next to the salt. This was the great democratization of flavor. The craving that had launched 1,000 ships and toppled empires had finally, peacefully been satisfied. The wars were over. The long, bloody, and fragrant chapter of human history that was the quest for spice had come to a close. The ghost on the tongue had been captured, tamed, and placed in a small glass jar accessible to all. And so, we return to where our story began, a warm kitchen. The small jars in our cupboards are the quiet, unassuming relics of this epic, violent, and world-changing story. They are the final resting place of a quest that redrew maps and connected hemispheres. The pinch of nutmeg you grate into a creamy sauce is a direct descendant of the trees at the heart of the Banda Islands massacre. The stick of cinnamon you stir into your mulled wine is a ghost of the Arab caravans and the fortunes of Venice. The clove you press into a holiday ham carries the echo of Pierre Poivre's audacious heist and the gardens of Mauritius. And the humble black peppercorn, the king of spices, is a monument to the courage of Vasco da Gama's sailors, the hubris of the Roman Empire, and the sacred rituals of the Egyptian pharaohs. The legacy of the spice trade is everywhere, woven into the very fabric of our modern world. The globalized economy, the interconnectedness of cultures, the very idea of multinational corporations all have their roots in the fierce competition for these fragrant seeds. The cuisines of the world are a testament to this great exchange. The chilies, a new world, spice, that are now essential to Thai and Indian food. The potatoes in an Irish stew, the tomatoes in an Italian sauce, the chocolate in a Belgian pastry, all are echoes of the age of discovery that the quest for Eastern spices initiated. Our world, in all its rich, diverse, and interconnected flavor is a world that was shaped by a craving for a spark of warmth, a touch of fire, a hint of a paradise garden on the other side of the world. A craving that proved to be one of the most powerful and relentless forces in human history. The great adventures are over now. The oceans have been mapped, the islands claimed. The secrets have all been told. What remains is the simple, quiet pleasure. The magic is no longer in the rarity, but in the memory, in the power of a scent to transport us. The smell of cinnamon can take us back to a grandmother's baking. The scent of cloves can conjure the joy of a winter festival. They are no longer the scent of empire, but the scent of our own lives, our own histories. And perhaps that is the most powerful magic of all. The next time you open a jar of spice and its ancient, familiar fragrance fills the air, take a moment. Inhale deeply. You are breathing in the final, peaceful sigh of a 5,000-year-long story. And as our long journey for tonight comes to a close, I want to thank you for sharing this time with us. If these stories help bring a little peace and wonder to your world, you can help us continue to create them with a simple gesture. A like on this video helps our small channel reach other people in search of quiet moments. And if you'd like to join us on our next journey, subscribing is the best way to ensure we travel together again. Your support means the world to us, but for now, let all of that fade away. Let the stories and the sense of the past dissolve into the stillness of the present moment. There is nothing left to do but to breathe. May your night be peaceful and your dreams be sweet. Sleep well